We are at the end, towards the end of chapter 14. Revelation chapter 14. I didn't quite get it finished one Sunday morning, and so we'll go back into Revelation chapter 14 and finish it up, answer some questions, and then we'll move into chapter 15. Because I tend to do these, I'm giving you sections of questions at a time, but I tend to do them digitally, and so I'm always looking at just one chapter at a time. So sometimes I forget what you have and what you don't have. And so don't ever hesitate the rest of this study to say, hey, we're about to head into a chapter and we don't have that yet. So don't hesitate to remind me. So chapter 15 questions, with all that said, are back there on the table. And so I think it's chapters 15 and 16, maybe 17 in that batch. And while I was working at that today, it's all printed. So anytime I forget, or we're heading into another chapter that you don't have yet, just remind me and I'll bring the stacks out and you can have the rest of the materials as we go. And so because of that, we'll probably, 15 only has 8 verses. So we're most likely going to finish chapter 15 today as well. I'm just going to go into chapter 16 when we're done with that, if we make it that far tonight. And then we'll deal with 15 questions and 16 questions together later on in our study, Lord willing. Okay, so chapter 14, and we're talking about these various plagues, if you will, and judgments, basically, that God is going to pour out upon those who have become oppressors of His people, against those, particularly rulers and leaders in nations, who have led others into sinful practices. And most likely, and my general conclusion has always been, that you're dealing with Rome here. You're dealing with the fall, the beginning stages of the fall of that empire, and you're beginning to deal with some very specific judgments that God says are coming. If you recall throughout this book, remember, this book is intended to encourage those Christians who are facing the oppression and challenges of that day. And so one of the most encouraging things, I suppose, if I were in that situation that I could hear, would be that God has not overlooked these things, that God has not somehow missed what these sinful folks have done to His people, and that judgment is on the way. And so that's really been the context of thought. It's not, and I'm way oversimplifying in a lot of ways with this statement, but it's not as big in a sense as we make it out to be sometimes. It really can be kind of summed up in that very simplistic approach that you've got those who are oppressing God's people. There are the martyrs and saints where their voices are being heard at the throne of God, and they're calling for vindication and a response to all the calamities that have come. And then ultimately God says, I'm coming. Here comes the judgment you've been waiting for. Here comes the answer to these challenges that you've been long awaiting for. And who's the center figure in all that can bring that judgment and can bring answer and can bring strength and encouragement? Christ. And He reigns supreme in the whole picture. And if you were trying to just sum it up in very simplistic ways, that's it. That's what the book, in a very simplistic approach, is about. In fact, here in chapter 14 and in verse 14, he talks about, and look, and behold a white cloud. When you see that term cloud, generally you're talking about judgments that have been brought. If you go back into Old Testament history and other aspects of discussion, you can see how judgment and clouds are often connected together. And so Jesus is part of this judgment that is coming, he says. One sat like unto the Son of Man. And when you hear the phrase Son of Man, what aspect of Jesus do you think of? Yes, this is humanity, right? How, it's not probably the best way to ask this question, but how is it in some senses that God is able to be able to grasp a tremendous understanding of what the human affliction is like? Yeah, because Jesus encountered it Himself. Because Jesus became a little lower than the angels. Jesus experienced humanity and then becomes the perfect mediator between man and God because He understands what it is like to walk. And so I think that's in some ways why you see this phrase, Son of Man. There's also some reference to what prophet that uses that same kind of language looking forward. Isaiah does some, and Daniel in particular. I think if you look, in Daniel chapter 7, probably around verse 13, you'll see some imagery where this kind of phrase about this one that is coming and the power that he would have to create a new nation that would be far greater than all others that was its predecessor. And so here's Jesus in this judgment that is to come. And the Son of Man, and experiencing and understanding the humanity behind all that. Having on his head a golden crown, and in his hand a sharp sickle. And so, on one side, if you're a follower of Jesus, is there anything to be feared? No, right? You've been sealed, you've been protected at times, you have the honor of heaven to look forward to. You're granted the redemption that will allow you to sing a new song. This chapter talks about it extols the wonderful benefits that come to the faithful and the patient and the enduring. But what's coming towards those who have rejected God and who have led others into sinful practices is not pleasant. There's a sharp sickle involved. Another angel comes out of the temple, probably implying the idea that with the authority of God, comes out from the temple, crying with a loud voice to him that sat on the cloud, "Thrust in thy sickle, and reap, for the time has come for thee to reap, for the harvest of the earth is ripe." Now, I'll come back to the generally, when we see the ideas of harvest and something being ripe, what generally do we think of? Good or bad? Good. Generally, through discussion within Scripture, we have seen when Jesus will even say the harvest is what? It's ripe and ready, but it needs reapers to go and bring it in. Generally, when you see the idea of harvesting, it's a positive connotation. And not so, I don't believe, here. He's talking about that the time is ripe to bring this judgment and to take this sickle. Because remember, he's going to pull these vines out, and what's he going to put them through? The winepress of the wrath of God. And so this is different than the kinds of things we might see in relationship to the harvest of the wheat that Jesus often talks about. Okay. Right. Yeah. I think that any time we see the words light or the appearance of the representation, I think when you see the Son of Man, angels, I don't know that any time they've ever been referenced as Son of Men, because they were always spirit beings. Right. And I think that's in connection to the ones we've already seen in relationship to the discussion within the context. Again, I think I'm not saying he sees Jesus specifically, and that somehow we've got to be careful not to overthink literally here. The figure that he sees is a representation of the humanity of Jesus. That's the vision. That's my thought. That the vision, within the vision that he sees, and again, these are still signs, symbols, visions. This isn't this isn't real in that sense. And so I think he's just talking about all the pieces that he sees within the vision. Within the vision, he sees angels being sent forth to bring the judgment. Within the vision, he sees the Son of Man, the humanity of Jesus involved in bringing forth this judgment. This is all just kind of the big picture that John sees within it. Mm-hmm. No, I believe in this particular occasion, he's talking about, and especially when he talks about a sickle. You think about a sickle, you're thinking about something just to go in and cut down, not necessarily a precision tool. and when it comes to that. Although I'm sure they were used in harvesting positively as well. But I think if you add the sum total of everything that he talks about, the sharp sickle, another angel, when we kind of got to this point Sunday morning, verse 18, another angel came out from the altar which had power over fire, and cried with a loud cry to him that had the sharp sickle, saying, Thrust in thy sharp sickle, and gather the clusters of the vine of the earth, for her grapes are fully ripe. And the angel thrust in his sickle into the earth, and gathered the vine of the earth, and cast it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And so the righteous would not be gathered and thrown into the winepress of the wrath of God. The evildoers that the judgment is coming to, I believe, is who's being pushed through the winepress of the wrath of God. So that's why I think this harvesting is of the oppressors. This harvesting in this particular moment. We've secured the 144,000. We've secured the faithful. And we've promised them redemption. And now here comes the judgment against probably most particularly Rome. And we'll talk a little more about that as we move forward. Any other thoughts, questions? So the winepress, verse 20, was trodden without the city, and blood came out of the winepress, even unto the horse bridles, by the space of 1,600 furlongs. By the way, if what I'm reading is correct, up to 200 miles, about a 200-mile reference there. Scholars have tried to take 200 miles or this 1,600 furlongs and try to squeeze it into something specific. None with great success. Some allude to it that it might be the whole of Italy. Some refer to it that it might fit certain other things, but nothing very precisely. So my conclusion would simply be he's talking about a large judgment, but not global. It's 1,600 furlongs. It's 200 miles. In other words, this is not end times judgment. This isn't Jesus' return and all men everywhere judged for eternity. This is limited. And I think when he uses this phrase about 1,600 furlongs, 200 miles, when he frames it and gives it limitation, it helps us understand that he's talking here in this moment about a very specific judgment, not the judgment of all men at the end of times. And I think you'll see that more clearly as you move forward into chapter 15 as well. All right, let's answer. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Bob. Yeah, and that's another. I read the same kinds of references that you could roughly look at Judea as a 200-mile, but that doesn't seem to fit because the judgment's more about Rome. If that's correct, that's why I'm saying it's hard. There are allusions people could kind of point to. None of them fit very well when you think about them as a whole. So that's why I've always just concluded that he's talking about a tremendous 200 miles, but a limited at the same token, specific judgment that's being brought. Okay, if you have your questions, grab them real quick for chapter 14. We'll move through them, and then we'll move into chapter 15 discussion. So the Lamb standing on Mount Zion is most likely a reference to Jesus or to Christ. That's correct. That's what I thought of. B and C were really statements, not questions. D, the scene is a symbolic vision of the redeemed from the earth who are in the church and under the protection of the Lamb. I think you can see some of that imagery in relationship to those things. E are all true. That's a statement, not a question. F, who could learn the new song that was sung before the throne? Yeah, I think the redeemed. If you go back, it was that 144,000 was the kind of the number that was being used. We've talked about them in the past, about how they were sealed at one point. Now they're spoken of as being the redeemed. And I think that would be an accurate answer to that. The idea of the redeemed are the ones, the redeemed or the faithful, those who had not given in to the guile and the sins and the things that he references otherwise. Again, G is just a statement. They're all true there in that moment. So skip on down to, there's one question at the end of the next page, which I think should be page 67 maybe. I don't think they're numbered that way anyway. So John saw an angel flying in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel message for whom? Okay, all the earth, all nations. Say that any way you want. I just simply thought of it, everyone. Right? His intention is to bring that message to everyone. The angel's message to the earth dwellers was all of those things, by the way. Those, again, are just statements, all found to be true, I believe. The second angel announced the fall of Babylon. We know that's symbolic. Why? Babylon's been going for a long, long time. Okay, by the time John writes this, Babylon's been going for centuries. And so we know that whatever is under discussion, that Babylon is being used as a reference. It's used as a symbol of something else. And we've generally concluded that the symbol of the power that is in that existing moment, which was Rome. Describe Babylon. Okay. She became quite influential. And unfortunately, her influence was not for good. And led others into sinful practices, which seems to be, in some senses, bringing greater consequence to her because of that. The third angel announced the consequences of worshiping the beast and his image. I believe that to be true as well. Again, F is more of a statement, and they're all true. Fire and brimstone, G, are symbolic of the judgment God has brought upon the unrighteous, such as Sodom and Gomorrah. It's true. We see that kind of phrase being used in other moments of judgment. The only future the unrepentant can look forward to is torment. That's pretty sad, isn't it? It's pretty alarming when you think about it. But that's the warning that's given in the text. Yeah, and no rest from it either. What is the patience of the saints? Okay, to stay faithful, to obey, to keep God's commandments, and maybe we could just sum it up in maybe this word, and that is those who endure. Those who endure the hardships, fight through the challenges, maintain a level of faith and integrity of patience through it all, are the ones that reap the benefit. Sometimes that's the hardest aspect sometimes of being a follower and a disciple of Jesus, is that when the hardships come and the challenges come because of my faith. And remember that those under discussion here in the book of Revelation, the vast majority of their hardships and challenges were simply coming because of their choice to be believers in Jesus. If they had willingly accepted the sign of the beast in their hand or on their forehead, would they be having any issues? No, that's right. No earthly issues. They have the freedoms they needed to buy, sell, work, labor, do whatever they chose to do. But the Christians are the ones who are enduring temporary hardship. But then the warnings come. Don't be succumbed by the temptation to give in, because judgment's coming. And it won't be pleasant for those who attach themselves to the beast in the discussion. A voice from heaven instructed John to what? To write, blessed. And that are the dead who die in the Lord. And that's, we use that phrase and we talk about that verse sometimes. And at times we pull it to refer in a very generic way to just all saints and receiving the reward of salvation. And there's some truth to that. But it's framed within this conversation of enduring some pretty heavy hardship. Blessed are they who die, literally, many of them literally dying in the Lord, because they are in the Lord. And so the reward's coming, and the fruit of their labors will follow them, and ultimately there's what? Rest from their labors. Skip on down. There's a few more questions. A is just a statement. B says clouds sometimes symbolize judgment. We've talked about that several times. The one like the Son of Man having on his head a golden crown. A vision of whom? Jesus. Most likely a vision of Jesus in the context. In his hand was not just any old sickle, but a sharp one. Another angel, the fourth, came out of the temple. And we mentioned briefly that might very well be a reference to the idea of the authority of God behind this judgment that this angel was bringing forth when you think of the temple. If we're right, in the mid-90s in relationship to the book, what's happened to the temple by now? It's already been destroyed in 70 A.D. And so if we're accurate in understanding the right date of that late date in the 90s, then we're not dealing with the literal temple here because it's already been destroyed. You're talking about the authority of and that imagery of the authority of God coming forth. The angel cried to him who sat on the cloud to reap, for the harvest is ripe. It's time, right? That when you see the harvest being ripe, what's that simply means? It's time. We've waited long enough. We've allowed for enough space and time for repentance. It's time. It's time to bring the judgment. The fifth came out of the temple in heaven with there's another sharp sickle. And another angel, the sixth, came out from the altar and had power over fire. When we think of altar, you think of what? Sacrifice and burnt offering and fire. And earlier in the narrative of the book of Revelation, what was under the altar? Yeah, remember those saints that had died for the cause of Christ? Were within the vision pictured as under the altar, and their voices coming forth before the throne of God. And so flow the imagery. Now here comes this angel from that same altar, in a sense, where all those voices and saints were represented. Those martyrs for Christ had been represented. And now that angel comes forth and begins to bring fire and judgment that's coming. And clusters of vine of the earth for her, I didn't finish that, grapes are fully ripe. The angel gathered the vine of the earth and threw it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. There may be a lot of things that press us in life. I can't imagine falling into the winepress of the wrath of God. And the tremendous amount of judgment and calamity that would be. The blood from the winepress was up to the horses' bridles, and as far as 1,600 furlongs, or measures out to be about 200 miles, if you do the math.
People see these things in everyday life.
Yeah, it's many of these things. And they understand what it means to reap in a harvest. They understand what a wine press is. They understand those imageries, certainly. Okay. Uh-huh. Yes, I believe all of this really, and if you were to pick one word, is just all the judgment of God that's being poured out against those that had challenged His people. Yep. No, I don't think there's any final judgment in this text. I don't believe there's any conversation about final judgment in this text. I believe it's limited to Rome. Specifically, if you ask me, it's limited to Rome. If you want to ask me in a more generic way, I would say it's limited to someone, if you understand what I mean. I believe it to be Rome, But without, I don't think there's any question in my mind that it's limited by the very nature of he gives us even a measuring distance and those kinds of things. And when you add chapter 15 as well, I think it'll even be clearer because of the things he says in chapter 15. And if you jump to 16, it'll just keep going, same direction. We won't get that far, though. Maybe. All right, so jump into chapter 15. Appreciate the questions. Good questions. And again, we're just dealing with about 8 verses here, a small section here in chapter 15. So he says, and I saw another sign. So you've seen this sign and vision of these angels, one after another, one after another, one after another. And as we've seen before in the narrative, then you may come to a moment of what we might call an interlude, where there's a pause in that conversation. And believe it or not, at times you get a moment where you have an interlude and then an interlude within the interlude. And then you come back to the discussion at hand. And so I think it's kind of where we're at right now. So he says, I saw another sign. So we've got this vision going on, and then here's another vision, if you will. Great and marvelous. 7 angels having the 7 last plagues, for in them is filled up the wrath of God. So, first imagery, throw in the sickle. Let's pull out all that sinful nation that's been challenging God's people. We're going to throw it in the winepress of the wrath of God. That's that image. Then he says, here's another image of the judgment that's going on. He said, and he compares this, that was to a harvest. This one's to the what? To plagues, right? That picture is of a harvest. This picture is how these plagues come forth and bring the wrath of God upon it. You see the word plagues, where's your mind go? Straight to Egypt, right? I think probably anyone who has any kind of understanding, even in their day, of history of God's people, you see plagues, mind goes to the judgment that God made against Egypt that ultimately allowed for His people to be set free. That's the imagery under Moses. Now that's the imagery we see here as well. Yeah. Yeah, and he's talking about, and I agree, Jim. When he says complete, he's talking about this judgment, though. You know what I mean? I don't think you're talking about a different judgment. He's talking about completing this one that's been under discussion. And my argument is, I still do not believe you're dealing with end times judgment. And I'll explain why I say that as we get further in the narrative. So he says, I saw as it were a sea of glass mingled with fire, and them that had gotten the victory over the beast, and over his image, and over his mark, and over the number of his name, stand on the sea of glass, having the harps of God. And so here's the vision he sees. And on one part of it, he sees these last plagues that are filled up with the wrath of God as he's kind of finishing this judgment, if you will, that he's bringing forth. He sees the people that reign victorious. He sees the faithful, he says, those who had gained victory over the beast, those who gained victory over his image that they were supposed to be bowing down to, and the mark that they refused to have in their hand or their foreheads, over the number of his name. And they stand on the sea of glass, having the harps, and they sing what? They sing the song of Moses, the servant of God. There's no coincidence here. I don't believe at all that you're dealing with plagues. Though the number is what? The number's different. But the imagery is we're pointing to plagues. So when you point to plagues, you think of Egypt. When you think of plagues in Egypt, you think of God's judgment against Egypt to allow the freedom of His people. To just kind of hone in on that and to maybe even in some ways help us understand that's the picture that's being drawn, he refers to whom? Moses. And so I think it becomes very clear to the reader what imagery he's trying to conjure as he writes here. But it's not just the song of Moses, but what else are they singing? The song of the Lamb. Remember how Moses led God's people to freedom? Who does it now? The Lamb. And so they're declaring the victorious Moses. They're declaring the victorious singing the song of the Lamb. When they got across the sea, what did they do? They sang praises, right? When the waters came across the Egyptians and devoured them, God's people sang praises to Jehovah for what He had done for them. They are singing praises to Jehovah for the freedom, the victory. They won. They may have never thought they'd ever be able to beat the beast. They may have thought they'd never be able to overcome the necessity to give in if you wanted to have any success in life or to even live under Roman rule. But they refused to do so. And now they stand upon this sea of glass and they're singing the song of freedom like Moses sang. And they're singing the song of freedom that's brought forth from the Lamb. Great and marvelous are thy works, Lord God Almighty. Just and true are thy ways, thou King of saints. Friends, it's just a moment of praiseworthiness that's being extended here. That this judgment has finally come forth and some relief is finally being experienced. What had those Israelites been doing before Moses finally comes? Right? And what were they doing in terms of their conversations with God? Yeah, crying, right? Crying for help and assistance. Will you avenge us? Free us from this. What were they experiencing? What were these Christians experiencing? God's children experiencing under this Roman rule? Bondage and enslavement. Not necessarily in exactly the same way as the Israelites in Egypt, but they were still in bondage to this ideology and to this mindset that you've got to bow down to this emperor if you want to exist in our society. But now they reign victorious. Who shall not fear thee, O Lord? When this judgment comes, who shall not fear thee? And glorify thy name. For thou only art holy. For all nations shall come and worship before thee. For thy judgments are made manifest. And after that I looked, and behold, the temple of the tabernacle of the testimony in heaven was open. So here's this interlude. Okay, judgment, judgment, judgment. Then you take a breath. John says, I see something else. I see the saints of God singing praises to Him. I see them singing the song of Moses and the Lamb. I see them praising how victorious God is, how wonderful God is, how holy God is, how wonderful His judgments are.
This Psalm 682, is that what he bases this part on that verse here? The new Psalms?
You in the Psalm book? And I assume that's the reference he's made, that the writer of the song. Yeah, and we sing, and that's the text from which that hymn is written. Yes, I believe so. So then he looks, verse 5, and behold, the temple of the tabernacle of the testimony in heaven was opened, and the 7 angels came out of the temple, having the 7 plagues, clothed in pure and white linen, and having their breasts girded with golden girdles. What's that imagery sound like? The girdle, the pure white, the golden girdles, breasts girded with that. What do you think of? Priests, right? Right? We just made a reference to Moses and the Lamb. Physical priesthood coming through Moses' brother Aaron. The imageries of what they were to wear and how they were to conduct themselves in certain aspects of their worship before God. And so again, these aren't unusual imageries. When he sees these angels clothed in the same imageries as the Old Testament priests. I did not say they are the Old Testament priests. That priesthood is gone. Under Jesus, He becomes the what? The high priest. And who's the priesthood? All the believers and followers of Jesus become His royal priesthood, the Bible teaches us. But this is imagery. And when you see this, the image of these 7 angels come forth, they look a lot, in John's eyes, they look a lot like the priests would have looked in the garments that they would wear. And one of the 4 beasts gave unto the 7 angels 7 golden vials full of the wrath of God, who liveth forever and ever. And the temple was filled with smoke from the glory of God and from His power, and no man was able to enter into the temple till the 7 plagues of the 7 angels were fulfilled. And so they're going to be sent forth to execute God's judgment upon the earth, and God's vengeance upon those who've harmed His children is on the way. And then you see the references to God's power to be able to fulfill these things. There even seems to be a picture of no one can even enter while the plagues are being sent forth. And what I simply see from that is that when the judgment comes, there's no heading to the temple. This is figurative. Remember, temple, if we're writing the date, temple's gone. But nobody can come and make intercession for Rome. When the judgment comes, it's coming. And he basically says, I'm closing the doors to the temple. Anyone who would try to make intercession on behalf of those who this judgment's coming against, it's futile. I'm barring that. It's time for the judgment. That's all I see here, is that God's basically saying that the time for their repentance is gone. The time and opportunity for them to turn and to change their disposition, that opportunity is gone. I am barring, I'm closing the door for intercession. It's time for judgment. And again, if you're in the midst of this oppression, you may be wondering, is God going to just forever and ever and ever? How long is He going to just continue to allow all these challenges to come without an answer? And the answer is He isn't going to wait forever and ever. And when He decides it's time to bring the judgment, when it's time to send the 7 plagues, when it's time to bring the consequence of then the door will be shut to opportunity to change that. No man was able to enter into the temple till the 7 plagues of the 7 angels were fulfilled. Again, John is seeing a vision of what is to come. He's not seeing something played out before his very eyes. He's seeing a vision, a picture of what is to come. And when God says it's time for the 7 angels with these 7 plagues to go down and bring this judgment of God, there's no stopping it. There's no intercession that could be made to change it. Judgment's on the way. Yep. Again, Bob, I don't think the picture simply is what is God, what was God connected to under that Old Testament system? If you would see Him referenced as residing at the temple, His connections to the tabernacle before the temple was ever built. Again, the idea here is just the authority of God. Where God resides, ultimately, where is He? He's in heaven. And I think that's the ultimate statement that He makes. Behold, and again, this is vision. The temple, the tabernacle, the testimony in heaven was open. So temple and tabernacle in some senses are irrelevant. Testimony is the key to the verse. Well, he says the temple of the tabernacle of the testimony in heaven was opened. And again, I believe he's talking about this testimony, this message of judgment that is to come. Again, I can be wrong. Don't misunderstand me. I've said that a billion times in this study. I don't make a lot out of the picture, because I think the picture is just talking about things that give us imagery of the authority of God. His temple, His tabernacle. But what's really under discussion? What's really under discussion is this testimony of judgment that He's sending forth and the message that's being delivered. That's the theme, if you will, of the moment. I'm trying to follow you a little bit, but uh-huh. Yeah. And again, I don't think you're talking about some kind of literal testimony that was once resides in the tabernacle. I think these are just imagery of where the seat of God has been. And when you're trying to picture the seat of God, you think of temple, you think of tabernacle, you think of heaven. And I believe all this imagery is just pointing to the authority that God has to bring this judgment. Now that may be oversimplified. I'm willing to accept that. But that's what I see. Any other questions? And some of this imagery, and we'll pause for half a second, and some of this discussion, though, I'll admit, is where some folks want to try to make the argument that this is pre-AD 70 language, to date Revelation earlier, because they want to take these imageries and point them at the literal destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. And I can understand how that could happen. I don't believe it to be accurate, but I can understand why that some might do that, because you've got all this conversation about the temple and that Old Testament system. And that's why some have been led to think that way. Jump to chapter 16. So I heard a great voice out of the temple saying to the seven angels, "Go your ways and pour out the vials of the wrath of God upon the earth." And the first went and poured out his vial upon the earth, and there fell a noisome and grievous sore upon the men which had the mark of the beast, and upon them which worshipped his image. What do you think of? When you think of sores and plagues, the boils, right? Okay. Comparative language. The second angel poured out his vial upon the sea, and it became as the blood of a dead man, and every living soul died in the sea. Those who receive the mark of the beast get caught up in the sores of verse 2, the judgment in the picture of that judgment. Those in the sea, remember there was a sea beast, was initially, then the earth beast, who basically pointed everybody back to the sea beast. Well, they get their judgment as well, that comes to those who were residing with those in the sea. The third angel poured out his vial upon the rivers and fountains of waters, and they became blood. The very first thing that very first plague they brought was the Nile turning in the water into blood. It's just similar pictures, imageries, because he already in chapter 15 made the connection between plagues of this judgment and the plagues of the judgment of Moses. That's right, and that's the picture. That's the picture that he's drawing. And if you wanted to try to figure out what kinds of calamities and how harsh the calamities were going to be when this judgment comes, then no better place to look than to what happened in Egypt in those days. I heard the angel of the waters say, "Thou art righteous, O Lord, which art and wast and shalt be, because thou hast judged thus. For they have shed the blood of saints and prophets, and thou hast given them blood to drink, for they are worthy." And so it's harsh, and it's dark, and it's unpleasant, but it's the judgment that's coming. It's the judgment that God is going to bring against those who have been challenging His people, who allowed themselves to be influenced by the great Babylon, Rome. It's the judgment that comes against those who maybe even at one time were believers in Jesus, but would not endure and gave themselves over to the mark of the beast. The judgment's going to be vast in that sense and going to be far-reaching to those who were challengers to that which is righteous. And His judgment is declared as being righteous in this. Verse 8, the fourth angel poured out his vial upon the sun, and power was given unto him to scorch men with fire. And men were scorched with great heat, and blasphemed the name of God, which hath power over these plagues, and they repented not to give Him glory. Now, here's one why I've been repeatedly saying that this judgment is specific to a moment in time, to a specific circumstance. What happens when Jesus returns and judgment occurs in relationship to what people say about God and Jesus? Every knee does what? Every knee shall bow and every tongue shall what? Confess. What are they doing at this judgment when it comes? They're not repenting. They're in fact they're blaspheming. They're digging in their heels. Final judgment, when Jesus comes at the second coming, every knee shall bow, every tongue shall confess. During this judgment that's under discussion here, people are just continuing to blaspheme and dig their heels in. Unrepentant. When Jesus comes, the picture's completely different. The clarity of the second coming of Jesus and the judgment that comes in connection with that through very simple and easily understood narratives in other parts of the New Testament, I believe help us clearly understand whomever you want to attribute these chapters to. Whoever, what you want to attribute to the Jews prior to the destruction of the temple, you want to apply it directly to Rome. I've told you what I believe about that. I don't think there's any argument, though, that you're not dealing with the second coming of Jesus. People don't continue to blaspheme the name of God at the second coming of Jesus. They get on their knees and they confess the name of Jesus. But when this judgment comes, they blaspheme the name of God. They dig their heels in and try to fight it out and repent not to give Him glory. The fifth angel poured out his vial upon the seat of the beast, and his kingdom was full of darkness, and they gnawed their tongues for pain. They're miserable. But what are they doing? In verse 11, and blasphemed the God of heaven. I mean, it is deplorable to think that God brought such a strong judgment against that nation, that great Babylon that was described in chapter 13, or chapter 14 rather. And they just dig their heels in and just completely blaspheme. In fact, blaspheme, verse 11 says, blaspheme the God of heaven because of what? Because of their pains and their sores, and repented not of their deed. In other words, whose fault is this in their minds? It's God's fault. I don't deserve this judgment. I didn't do anything wrong. I'm not worthy of such a calamity. And they're blaspheming the name of God and saying, you're the cause of this. As if they had no culpability whatsoever. I think there's a lot of challenge sometimes in the book of Revelation, particularly in trying to understand who and when the imageries apply. But I think that we can easily see that so far we're dealing with very specific, limited judgment against a particular nation who brought challenging consequence to God's people. And it does not fit the description of what the Bible clearly says will happen when the second coming of Christ occurs. And to me, we can have challenges and discussions and try to figure out exactly who may be under discussion or when is the timing of these things. But one thing I think we can clearly see is this judgment and final judgment. Two different things. Two different things. And if we don't understand anything else about it, if we get that, we've made I believe, an important understanding of the text.